Good morning, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse, alongside my co-host, as always, Mr. Martin Popoff.
Yes, morning, sir. How are things this morning?
Good, bright,
Yeah.
sunshiny, not a cloud in the sky. 80 degrees, I think it's going to be today. We have finally hit spring here in New York. So took
Yeah. It's hot here too. I got out and played a little football with my son yesterday, and I ended up getting a migraine last night. So I'm a little foggy this morning. So we'll see. So
I
yeah,
hear
it was a
you.
little hot.
The sinuses, all the flowers are blooming and the pollen's in the air. And I woke up this morning. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is not fun. But we have a fun topic to talk about. So this God, where did this idea come from, Martin? Was this from a viewer? Was this one of yours? One of mine? I don't even remember anymore.
I don't know. I don't remember either.
I don't know. Anyway, whatever. If it's one of the viewers, thank you for this idea. Basically, we're looking at bands that released two really good albums in 1 year, which nowadays may seem kind of strange and something that doesn't happen that often. But back in the day, it was a pretty regular occurrence. So Martin and I were kind of like, all right, let's see if we can go find a bunch of those. And we found a few. We're like, all right, we think we have a little bit of a show. And then we kept looking and we found more and we found more and we found more. And before you know it, I mean, I have like a stack of stuff over here sitting right off camera that like of really cool albums by really notable bands that were just cranking out stuff, like especially in the 70s, even to the early 80s. You go into the studio for a couple of weeks, crank out an album, go tour for a few months, and then get back into the studio, crank out another album, go back on tour, and that was the formula. It's like album tour, album tour, album tour, album tour, and it's amazing to think that some of these classic albums were put together really quickly in the studio. They didn't need 6 months, 8 months, a year in the studio to put together some of these gems, right? So we're going to kind of talk about some of these, and also talk about, well, how about after these two albums in the same year? What did they do next? Was that any different from the formula or not? And kind of what kind of happened after those two quickly released albums? So I'll have Martin start us off here today.
Yeah. So yeah, and the funny thing, of course, now is well, for years and years, the norm became an album every 2 years or 2.5 years, and
Yeah.
now if you're Metallica or Iron Maiden, you put out two albums at the same time on one album, and then go away for 6 or 7 or 8 years, right? Sort of thing. So yeah, so this is a rare thing. And I thought was kind of interesting about this. Like we're gonna do 10 each, and we'll do it in threes, right? Just to speed it up a bit. But what I find interesting is we didn't compare our notes at all. So it's going to be I've got a little piece of paper. I want to write down what your order is going to be and how many of them overlap, sort of thing. So I'll do my 10, 9, and 8. And my notes are a mess because I kept finding new ones and moving them around. So my first one at the number 10 slot is Rush with Fly By Night and Caress of Steel. And what I love about this is immediately it's a huge step up from the debut. Of course, Neil joins the band, but they essentially invent progressive metal and then put out two, pretty definitive texts of this new kind of music where you're just smooshing a guitar with a distortion pedal on it against prog rock, and boom, you've got this new thing, right?
Yep.
And they're two beloved albums in the Rush catalog. So we've got February 15th, 75 for Fly By Night, and then September 24th, 75. So about 8 months later. So that's my number 10. My number 9 is this one, which we've got Motorhead Overkill, followed by Motorhead Bomber. Both in 1979. And what I like about this one is it's very similar. There we go. Very similar to the Rush situation in that you've got a little bit of a wobbly, older school album to start with, and then everything changes, right? And with Motorhead, I mean, Fast Eddie was kind of half in the band already, but with Motorhead, the main thing is they get on Bronze Records, and they essentially put out these two records that I've often argued are two of the heaviest records of the entire 1970s. So that's pretty cool with these great album covers. So that's my number 9. And my number 8 is this one, Thin Lizzy Jailbreak to Johnny the Fox. And again, the idea here is you've got there we go. You've got two of their definitive albums, both in 1976. We've got March 26th, 76 for Jailbreak, and October 16th for Johnny the Fox. You know, I've often, I mean, Renegade and Black Rose are probably my favorite Thin Lizzy albums, but I've often said Johnny the Fox. I've always had that high.
Yeah,
and then Jailbreak is the most famous one. So they did a great job in 1976. So that's my my 10, 9, and 8.
cool. So, you know, just to give a little backstory here. So Martin and I did not want to compare notes on this. And we both said we were going to come to the episode with lots of choices just in case we overlapped, because we knew we would. So that's why I was kind of smiling before there and I had those ready to go. So I have so many picks here that I was banking on the fact that Martin and I would pick some of the same ones. I'm like, it's cool. I got other ones. So
so you're going to switch some out. Okay. So that's cool.
Yeah, I'm going to switch some out. Martin, I have so many of them. So I was like, all right, I came knowing that would happen. So let me do some prog to start things off with. So let's go to 1974. So we've got King Crimson release Starless and Bible Black early in the year. Later in the year, they put out Red, right? Some may say two of the in the short list of definitive albums for King Crimson, but it's a band kind of in disarray and implosion. And after, you know, David Cross leaves the band after this album, he still records a little bit on this album, but he's really not part of the band. They release this, they play the Central Park show, and then basically King Crimson is kind of no more. And Robert Fripp puts it to bed. He goes out and does all sorts of things with other people, with Brian Eno and Peter Gabriel and David Bowie and so on and so forth. And then we don't see King Crimson for 7 years till the Discipline album in 1981. And then it's a completely different band, completely different sound, completely starting over for the new decade. So that's the first one here. Next, we're going to go to, let me just find them in my notes here. Gentle Giant. We've got Three Friends and Octopus, both released in 1972. Arguably their two greatest albums. I mean, I think the creativity in the band is just off the charts here. But after Octopus comes out, Phil Shulman, one of the three brothers, one of the three founding members, leaves the band. They don't replace him. They decide to kind of streamline the sound just a little bit. They release In a Glass House the next year. Sound is a little bit more rock based, and then they continue on with Freehand and Power and the Glory and all those still really complex progressive rock albums. But I think some of the more artsy elements of the band kind of ended with Octopus, even though those albums that came after are still considered some of their best, and I would argue they might even be. But two amazing, groundbreaking albums all in 1 year in 1972. And then we'll stick with Prague, we'll stick with the UK, we'll go to Genesis, A Trick of the Tail, and A Wind and Wuthering. So these are the first two albums post Peter Gabriel leaving the band to go solo. Phil Collins steps into the vocal chair and continues to play drums. Arguably, these albums don't miss a step at all. They're still highly regarded albums in the Genesis catalog. Maybe a little bit of pop leaning starting to come into play with this album, but after this album, Steve Hackett decides, you know what, guys? You're not really utilizing enough of the songs that I bring to the table. I think I'm just going to go solo. And they do the follow-up album. And then there were basically the three guys left, Collins, Rutherford, and Banks. And then there were three, still very much a prog album, but you can kind of hear the pop direction coming into the band, and that would continue on over the next couple albums. But two highly, highly regarded albums that prove they could still do great prog albums after Peter Gabriel left the band. Well, I'll turn it back to you.
Nice. And I forgot to mention, and maybe you want to follow up as well, but the what happened afterwards. So with my three, all three of them almost made what you would call the end point of a trilogy. I mean, 2112 for Rush, Ace of Spades with Motorhead, and what was my other one? Thin Lizzy, Bad Reputation. So you know, many fans of those bands would arguably put those three records together. So one was a follow-up in 76, one was an 80, one was a 77. All right. So my number, what are we up to? Seven. Yes. So my number 7 is Queen 2, March 8th, 74, and Sheer Heart Attack, November 8th, 74. Again, you know, Queen 2 is considered a very proggy album, a dense album, lots of action going on. Sheer Heart Attack, kind of the same thing. I mean, they're very similar to Queen 1, and I would argue that they changed a fair bit for Night at the Opera. So I think again you've got almost a trilogy going on with those records. So that's my 7. Now we go up to 6 is what we got here? Big historic one with Led Zeppelin 1.
There you go.
January 12th, 69, and Led Zeppelin 2, October 22nd, 69. You got to put that in because that's two of the tantamount aircraft carrier albums of all time. Super important albums, and very similar. I think they're ones that have that big mix of the folk and the blues with that 31.3% amount of new nascent heavy metal going with them as well. So super important one there. And then I'll add in a little prog here. Couldn't find my Fragile, but we've got my Yes album, and the Yes album and Close to the Edge and Fragile are considered, three of the major textbooks of Yesdom. So that's pretty cool. February 19th, 71 and November 26th, 71. So yeah, in most cases, these are separated by like 8 months or 9 months or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to add too that I've never really thought that it would have been super hard for these bands, all of them, to put out 2 albums a year. I mean, they act like it's a big deal, but to come up with 35 minutes of new songs or 40 minutes of new songs, I just never, it seems like the funnest part of the job. So you would think it was something that these guys could really do. Like when they complain about, all of a sudden we had to do our next album, it's like, we'll sit down and write some songs. It can't be that hard, right? So I don't know
how. I mean, you and you've written a ton of rock biographies, and we've read a ton of them. How many of them complain that they hated spending time in the studio?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, other than a guy like maybe Jimi Hendrix or maybe a select few, most of them don't talk highly about the time spent in the studio and dealing with producers and coming, and how many of that we got off the road and we had to sit down and write songs and we had nothing, right? The well was dry. I mean, you hear that and read that all the time. Yeah. So you would think it would be the easy part of it. You would think going out, being out on tour is the hard part of it, but a lot of them don't say that, strangely enough.
I know. And even more so, it's like, we had a hard time coming up with a band name or an album name. It's like, well, that's totally the funnest part of the job, right? It's like easy. Like give me 10 minutes. I'll give you 20 band names or albums.
Ask me to help, right? Please. I'll gladly
absolutely fun, right? But yeah, it's I always thought, it's not, who am I to say, right? I'm not a rock star, but I mean, it just seems like it wouldn't be that hard to write a bunch of songs, right? So I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's a silly thing to say, but okay. So I think I did 3 there. Over to you.
Okay. All right. So let's move over to Elton John, 1973. Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player. And then a couple months later, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Arguably 2 of his greatest releases, right? I know most people always cite this as one of the great double albums of all time. Dynamite, this album too, lots of hit singles all across these albums, millions and millions of album sales, right? And then they follow this up with Caribou, which is seen, even though it's sold pretty well, I think it's still sold like 2 million copies, but seen by a lot of people as kind of a step down from the quality of these and the albums that came before. This was like a pretty extensive run for Elton and Bernie of chart-topping albums with loads of great songs and just legendary releases. And Caribou only had 2 hit singles, kind of unfocused, a little bit all over the place, stylistically speaking. But these 2 definitely great albums, all in the same year. It's hard to believe that they would release anything else in a year that this came out, right? But that just goes to show you what was going on back then, right? All right, so let's move to where do I have them here? Where are they on my list? Oh, we're gonna go with the Beatles. 1965, Help and Rubber Soul. I mean, the Beatles were just cranking out albums left and right. I mean, this was a time when, this band was just like, the creativity was just like off the charts. So both of these massive albums. And for a lot of people, Rubber Soul kind of started the dive into psychedelia for the band. And then with their next album that came out in 1966, Revolver, that really is the band's kind of full-on move into psychedelia. Then you got Sgt. Pepper after that and all those other albums. So 2 very notable albums in one year for them. And then we're going to go to 1968. We're going to go Jimi Hendrix, Axis Bold as Love, and Electric Ladyland. Right? So this would follow the RU Experience, one of the best trio of albums to start a career for any artist ever. Unfortunately, that would be it. There would be no studio album to follow this one because the experience was basically over and done with. There's a whole bunch of touring and live albums and the Band of Gypsies and whatnot, but Jimmy would, in his lifetime, would never release another studio album of all original material. And so essentially this was it. So nothing to follow. So back to you.
Okay, so I'll do 3, not 4. So this is 4, 3, and 2. We've got another super important story in the history of rock.
Yep.
Black Sabbath with Black Sabbath February 10th, 70, and then Paranoid September 18th, 70. I've always talked about, there you go. I've always talked about these 2 records, In Rock and Very Heavy, Very Humble, as being the 4 albums that invented heavy metal. And it's pretty amazing that Sabbath had 2 of them. And the first one's got some things that do that. It's about 41% of it that's this modern new nascent heavy metal, but Paranoid is more like 72.8% completely heavy metal, right? And some really more stunning, important, right between the eyes sort of things going on with that. Yeah, and then they followed up with Master of Reality, and it got even heavier and more thicker sound. Okay, my number 3 was let's see what we got here. We've got our Heroes and Our Low from David Bowie.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. Yep.
Yeah, so that was a really cool one as well. We've got January 14th, 77 for Low, October 14th, 77 for Heroes. That whole Berlin period thing. And this was, these are the most respected, most critically acclaimed David Bowie albums. You've got some really innovative stuff going on with synthesizers there as well, and some Fripp involved and all that. A lot of instrumental stuff. So it's kind of ambient and cool and Eno-ish and all that. And my number 2 was sort of the first one I thought about in this, because where's my other copy of this? Oh, well, I'm not sure where it went, but anyways, we've got Magician's Birthday and Demons and Wizards. And again, these are the 2 most respected Heap albums in terms of consensus. They both did well. They both went gold. So yeah, that's my 4, 3, and 2.
Not only did Uriah Heep do those 2 in 1972, they did these 2 in 1971.
Nice.
I was going to, if you didn't pick it, I was going to cheat and I was going to do all 4 of them in one shot because, quite frankly, I mean, what other band releases 4 really strong albums in the span of not even full 2 years, right? So Salisbury, with the big epic sidelong track, follows up Very Heavy, Very Humble, their amazing debut. And then just a few short months later, they pump out Look at Yourself, my personal favorite Uriah Heep album of all time, and then those 2 classics that Martin just showed. So, I mean, that's hard to match right there. That's hard to match right there. All right, what else we got? I got tons of stuff here, Martin. Hold on. Let's go to 1974, I believe. Yes, 1974. We've got Deep Purple Burn, followed up by Stormbringer. When we were sitting down to do this, I totally forgot that these albums came out in the same year. And quite frankly, the fact that the Mark 3 and 4 era of Deep Purple all happened within 2 years, barely over 2 years, and then they were gone. It's crazy when you think about it. Yeah. So, of course, this signals the arrival of David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes into the band. They then pump this album out, which is a little bit different than this, a little bit more funky and soulful. Blackmore doesn't like it at all. He leaves the band to go form Rainbow. Tommy Bolin comes in. They release Come Taste the Band after this, which is not all that different from these particular albums here, except you got a different guitar player. Maybe it's a little bluesier, or whatnot, whatever you want to call it. But there's those 2. And then we're going to go to, hold on, let me get my dates here. This was 1977. Heart magazine. Okay. And then Little Queen. Both came out the same year. Follows the great debut from the band. This one kind of an interesting one because this one there was all sorts of dealings with the problems with the record label and whatnot. This actually got I don't know, was this actually released in 77 or recorded in 77? There's a whole weird backstory with the magazine album. But anyway, they're both from 1977. And then Dog and Butterfly follows. This kind of, this formula stays the same, not much different over the first 4 or 5 Heart albums, just really, really solid stuff. And then my number, where are we here? All right, so let's go to 1980. Saxon, Wheels of Steel, and Strong Arm of the Law. All right. So Denim and Leather quickly follows this one up. You mentioned trilogy of albums. I would definitely say that Wheels of Steel, Strong Arm and the Law, and Denim and Leather forms this kind of like early classic trio of Saxon. They all go together. They all sound similar. To me, I listened to these albums. They could have all come from the same session for me. It could have been a one long double album because I think everything kind of goes the same. And most people cite the three albums as, if they're not their favorites from Saxon, they're among their favorites. So there you go.
Nice. Okay. All right. So here's my number one. I've got some honorable mentions after, but we'll do your number one first, and then we'll see what we left out. But yeah, Stained Class, and not this record because I don't have my Killing Machine anymore, but Hellbent for Leather came out in 79, but Killing Machine, lacking Green Manalishi, came out in 78. So we've got Feb 10th, 78 for this. Famously, the same day Van Halen's debut album came out, and Killing Machine, October 9th, 78. And I had to pick this one. This one is far and away my favorite because they are, two albums that on any given day I could put in my top 20 of all time. Killing Machine / Hellbent is my favorite Priest album. And also, I've often argued that on an objective level, not a subjective level, but on an objective level, Priest during that run and Queen during that run are the most, genius music makers of all time, kind of thing. So yeah, these are super, super important albums in the history of heavy metal. Unfortunately, most people would argue Stained Class is the most important one. I like Hellbent more, but Stained Class kind of historically is more of a huge up ratchet in the improvement of heavy metal. So that's my number one.
Cool. Well, I was going to pick that too, but in the sake of variety, I will throw another because I got more here. Let's go with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Tarkus, and Pictures at an Exhibition. I can believe this one came out first. I mean, who releases? And this is kind of cheating in a little way because this is a live album, but it's not a live album of their own material. This is a live album playing like a classical work. It works really well as like a standalone album. So, and just amazing over the top stuff from ELP on this. And they kind of continue that whole epicness on Tarkus, which of course has the side-long epic and other great songs on here as well, like Bitches Crystal and Infinite Space and whatnot. So two classic albums from the band. They would then go on to put out the album Trilogy the next year, which is much more, kind of weird that I'm saying this, but more of like song-based ELP. I don't know if ELP really does song-based stuff. Everything they do is kind of epic, but I think after the first three albums, I think Trilogy was kind of like an interesting direction to go to because it has more like traditional type songs on it. So yeah, two pretty cool albums from 1971.
So before we look at honorable mentions, I mean, how many of yours on your official list would have overlapped with mine? Just everything that you showed, or?
Yeah, so I also had Judas Priest, I had Thin Lizzy, I had Led Zeppelin, I had Black Sabbath. What else? Anything else that overlapped? I had Yes. But yeah, so a few of them. I had Motorhead as well. So
yeah. All right.
So that's why I came armed and ready, Martin, because I knew we
yeah. I have no more props, but I've got a list of honorable mentions as well. And yeah, my notes kept bouncing all over the place because I kept knocking stuff off and moving them around, right? So but yeah, let's see. So honorable mention. Well, I've got about 10 here. I'll say 5 and you say 5. How's that? So and then we'll go back. But I had Stars Attention Shoppers, January 78 to Coliseum Rock, which was the last one. So they went from the abysmal mellow one that shocked us all, and then Coliseum Rock was heavy again. It was a correction. Alice Cooper, Love It to Death, March 71 to Killer, November 71. And then Schools Out was June 72. But then Alice Cooper again, Billion Dollar Babies, March 73 to Muscle of Love, November 20th, 73. I had Ramones Leave Home to Rocket to Russia. So two of the most beloved Ramones albums. I would say Rocket to Russia, people more or less say is the best one. Pretty obvious one. We had Kiss Destroyer, March 15th, 76, and Rock and Roll Over, November 11th, 76. But I don't know. What else do you have?
Okay, well, we've already repeated a few there. So I have 2 left that have not been mentioned yet. So okay. I'll throw those out here. We've got ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. We got ELO 2 and On the Third Day. All right, these both came out in 1973. By now, it's basically all Jeff Lynne here. Roy Wood is basically gone from the band. I think, and then on the next album, they put out El Dorado, which moves the band into full-blown kind of like concept album territory, complete with an orchestra and whatnot. And the band all of a sudden discovering that they can write pop singles, right? In addition to doing their, however you want to call it, classically inspired progressive rock. But two really, really strong albums here. And then I've got them in a collection here, but 10 years after, 1970, Cricklewood Green and Watt both came out in the same year. All right, both really good examples of the early blues rock style that the band were employing at the time, and they would follow that up with the Space and Time the next year, where they're starting to incorporate more mainstream pop and rock elements, and they had the big single with "I'd Love to Change the World." So those are my last two.
Nice, nice. Okay, I had a couple more here. So I had Kiss Kiss, February 18th, 74, and Hotter Than Hell, October 22nd, 74. And people really, a lot of people call Hotter Than Hell their favorite Kiss album of all time. Of course, Destroyer, the first of our 76, people call that the favorite. And then I also had Nazareth Razamanaz, May 5th, 73, and Loud and Proud, November 9th, 73, considered the two favorite Nazareth albums. Maybe you put Hair of the Dog in there as well. And then Sweet, Sweet Fanny Adams, April 74, and Desolation Boulevard, November 30th, 74, which are considered the two milestone anchor albums, although, Give Us a Wink is my favorite. And then kind of a weird one, Roxy Music, For Your Pleasure, March 21st, 73, and Stranded, November 73. And then they followed up with Country Life. So yeah, there were a lot of these,
Yeah, I mean, you uncover more than I did, and you got some that I can't believe I kind of missed out on, which is good. And you have to, when you look at the overall list, Martin, like how many of these albums do you think that most people consider like among their best, if not their best?
Yeah,
quite a few of them.
Yeah. And in a lot of cases, if it's a first album, we get that trope of it's all the songs we had hanging around. And the second one, they say, we had to write it all in a hurry. But, I've now learned from interviewing lots of rock stars that usually with the second album, they're still dealing with songs that they had hanging around before their first album.
Right. Because how many times did the record label say, all right, we need another album? The first album did really, really well. I know you guys are out on tour, but we need an album right away. Oh, all right, this is what we got left over. Right. They haven't had time to go in and really prepare for the second album. That's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why it had to just kept getting more, drawn out and drawn out. I think when these guys retire, most of them probably would have wished they would have got more albums out, right?
Yeah. I mean, and think of like the bands that did not make this list, right? I one of the first bands I went and looked at the discography was the Who, and I was like, the Who had to have done like a couple albums in the same year back then, and not even close, right? I mean, I was surprised by that. I mean, even early on, like Townsend and Company took a long time to put their albums together, so I was really shocked. I expected more to be on this list, but yeah, and some of them were not that prolific at all.
Drug habits. So heroin slows down bands quite fast. And, and so do hangovers, lots and lots of hangovers slow down bands. Right. So that definitely, usually when a band goes quiet for a lot of years, something's wrong. So,
yeah, we didn't have the Stones on this list. I didn't look them up, but how about Status Quo, who have like 1 million albums? Did they ever do 2 in 1 year? I don't know. I didn't look.
I thought maybe they got a 74 thing going there. I think they had a bit of a period in there, but yeah, Stones. I remember, looking at the Stones. I don't think there's a single one all the way through that whole thing. Eh?
Yeah, even early on.
Yeah,
I was surprised. I was really surprised. I didn't look at the Kinks. That's another band that maybe, but a lot of the metal bands like were not that. They were like 1 a year, but not necessarily 2 a year. I guess the shift started to change in the early 80s, where bands were spending a little bit more time in the studio and not just kind of pumping the albums out like a lot did in the 70s, because both of our lists are very skewed towards the 70s. It's not a ton of 80s stuff in here. That's kind of telling.
Yeah, and there might have been also that ethic of the whole songwriting factory thing and singles, and it just seemed like it seemed like more of a cynical business of just pumping out product, right? You got the fake bands. I've been updating my old Thin Lizzy book, right? That's going to come out in paperback eventually. But, reading that whole Funky Junction story and stuff, like weird stories like that. It's like, oh, some German businessman says, let's put a covers album of Deep Purple songs together and let's just hire Thin Lizzy to do it,
Yeah, why not?
and Benny and some other guy. And then they put on like a picture of some other, they put on a picture, I think it's a picture of Hard Stuff on the front cover of Funky Junction. And then it's some Thin Lizzy guys playing Deep Purple songs. It's like, let's just put out some product, right? Like weird things like that would happen. Remember that whole Ken Hensley Head Machine, Hell Preachers thing, all that kind
Oh
of
yeah,
stuff?
that's a pretty damn good album. I like that. Yeah,
Just bizarre what they used to do, but yeah, and I'm thinking of some of these bands, and I, Thin Lizzy's a good example, but Sweet definitely, and the Who even. It's like there was a lot of a little cottage industry in making singles, right? Standalone singles all the time too, right?
Yeah, that was a big thing back then. It's like it wasn't all that important to go crank out an album. I will just record a couple songs, release them as a single. The public will be happy with that, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that reminds me of the conversation we were just having yesterday or the day before about next week's show, right? And about how, I don't know, Martin, you want to give a little preview of what we're going to be talking about next week? We haven't
That's
really.
right. Yeah. So we did a little looking at, we're going to look at very, very, very recent RIAA certifications for gold and platinum. And you'd be surprised about some of our favorite old classic rock bands or whatever, metal bands, prog bands, and recent certifications and why that happens and how that happens, and how cool that is and how important that is. But yeah, just stuff that if you're not browsing the wiki pages, you're not going to notice. But the other good thing, to Wikipedia's credit, I checked a couple of them, and they do notice when these certifications happen, and they do update it and stuff. So yeah, we're going to talk about some happy stories about some new certifications.
Yeah, both of us were kind of blindsided to see some stuff that still is selling, and still the certifications are still adding up, and it's like, wow, that's kind of cool, right? But and you can only go back and look so far. How far back did you say it goes, Martin? I didn't go.
Yeah, I could only go back, and then it kind of broke on me, and I couldn't get the search thing and the advanced search to work on the RIA site. But I went back to February 22 or something like that. So we've got a good little list to discuss. But yes, to remember, and we'll go into it more on the episode. But really, it's more based on streaming, right? And then we'll go into what's filling up the whole list, right?
Yeah, because it's the model has changed, right? It's not like it used to be. It's not all about album and CD sales anymore. So there's a lot more that goes into it. So that'll be next week. So, but before then, Martin, what's going on? Books on the website? You got anything available?
Well, yes, I want to thank you for that AC/DC review. That was pretty cool, and we've got some, we got some sales from that, so that's good to see. But yeah, the books are all at martinpopoff.com. We got the Contrarians video show. We just did a What If ZZ Top made a concept album about cars. Just did that, and we've got Tim Derling, who put together a Sammy Hagar concept album about UFOs and outer space. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, we started doing that kind of thing. And then the podcast episode, the audio podcast, is History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff.
Cool. Sounds good. Lots going on. So stay tuned here on SOT this weekend. I will be ranking the solo albums from the voice of rock himself, Mr. Glenn Hughes. That's coming up on Sunday, which of course is Mother's Day here. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, we kick off the work week next week with In the Prog Seat on Tuesday, where we will be doing a in-depth album study, breaking apart, turning upside down, a passion play by Jethro Tull. So that's coming up on Tuesday. So stay tuned for that. Also, we got UK Connection next week. It's AOR Melodic Rock Time. That'll be next Saturday. And then I'll be back with another Ranking the Album show on the following Sunday. And joining me for that one is Mr. Rich Catino. We will be ranking the catalog of Norway's Dimmu Borgir. So that's coming up a week from this Sunday after the Glenn Hughes ranking. So till
Love
then,
that Hudson Valley Squares, by the way. The whole what if you replace this guy with that guy thing?
Yeah, that was fun.
Hilarious.
That was fun. Yeah, we enjoyed doing that one. That was a Chris Allo idea, and that was interesting how everybody on the panel kind of perceived and took the assignment, and then some of the picks too. That was a lot of fun. That was good. I like doing those kind of what if things every now and then. They're pretty cool. So thanks for watching, everybody. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as it posts. And please do hit the like button before you leave. And have a wonderful weekend, everybody. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. We'll see you real soon and next Friday here on the Funhouse. Bye-bye.